And it's a real pleasure for me to be sitting here. My name is Alina Rocha Menocal, as some of you may know, and I'm usually an ODI employee, but I am now on secondment with the Developmental Leadership Program at the University of Birmingham. And it's a real pleasure to actually be able to be here taking part in this launch event. I also have had a bit of a history of involvement with the Development Progress Program with issues relating to political voice. So it has been a great pleasure to see how this whole program has evolved over time and some of the really great outputs that it's putting out there for everybody to enjoy. So what we are going to spend the next hour and a half or so doing is digging deeper perhaps into the issues that were highlighted in the case studies of Liberia and Timor-Leste, but actually being able to look at it perhaps from a broader perspective and looking at these questions beyond these two countries to ask really about what factors drive progress in security, and whether and how there's a role for international actors to contribute. So Lisa, who is joining us hopefully still, I hope I haven't been the cause for her to go to sleep, although I understand it's really very, very late for her. But Lisa has put together, in conjunction with the Development Progress team, a great panel of experts to indulge in a kind of debate type conversation over the next 45 minutes or so. And I just briefly wanted to introduce them. And I'm very glad actually that we have our lady here joining. So starting with her, that is Dr. Eka Ikpe, who is a research associate with the African Leadership Center, Conflict Security and Development Group. And then joining her is Dr. Oliver Utersonke. I should have better German than that, but sorry about that. Who is head of research for the Center on Conflict Development and Peace Building at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. And here, immediately to my left, is Mr. Mark White, who is the deputy head of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office's Conflict Department, and he is also the deputy responsible for the newly created Conflict Stability and Security Fund, which supports integrated delivery of Her Majesty Government's National Security Council objectives. And before that, he was for quite a bit of time at the Stabilization Unit. And so what Lisa has done for us, which is quite helpful, is she has given me some broad questions that I would like to ask our speakers to think about and digest. And we have, I would say, two bigger questions and then two smaller questions. So, sorry, this is my watch, so I can't actually make it shut up. But anyway. So if we can actually spend about 15 minutes in the bigger questions, so that would mean, if my math is correct, about 5 minutes or so per person, and then a bit shorter than that for the less bigger questions, and then hopefully we'll have the possibility to invite the audience to ask any questions that they may have or engage in the debate as well. So just to give you a bit of the outline of what this will look like, so that you can also think through what you want to prepare in terms of your remarks. The first big question on the table really, again, is about what factors drive security progress. Obviously, we heard from Liberia and Timor-Leste, but also we would like to hear from your experiences more broadly about what drives progress in emerging conflict settings, what matters at the local, national, regional, and or international level, and how these interact. There were a lot of points being raised earlier from Liberia and East Timor about the importance of elite bargains, behind the scenes negotiating, maintaining fragile pacts for peace, and whether from your experience this holds, and what the role of wider citizen engagement might be, and how populations more broadly can be incorporated into the peace building agenda. And again, I think from our case studies, very much this tension between short-term versus longer-term security needs and priorities. And then that's one of the big questions. Another one of the big questions is about the role of international actors, and I think it was striking that we heard from both Liberia and Sierra Leone how much of a big presence international actors have had, the UN, others, how in East Timor it was actually quite important to help build the legitimacy of the state and get things moving, and how in Liberia, despite the fact that it has been instrumental in bringing stability, at the end of the day, these reforms are not as successful. So what counts and what's important? I wanted to add another smaller question to the mix, perhaps between those two big questions, which is there was a discussion here about the mutation of conflict when the state is no longer the main sponsor of state-led violence, let's say, and the aim is no longer to take over the state, as in conflict war situations. What does violence look like? And I come from Mexico, and I'm feeling very, very clearly that in my country's context, for example, violence definitely has mutated into a form of organized crime type of activity that threatens a lot of the governance structures there. And I was curious to see in other conflicts that are perhaps more fragile and emerge from conflict, what does this look like? Who are the agents of violence, and what kinds of challenges do they pose when it's no longer the state that is mostly responsible, at least explicitly and formally? And then for perhaps the last bit, to really ask you from your experiences and your knowledge, what kind of important research gaps you think need to be filled in this agenda to better understand what constitutes progress and what helps to build progress in post-conflict settings. And now I have been given this thing, which I barely know what it is. I suppose it's a very mini iPad that I don't know how to use. But I suspect that it's to invite people to chat with us online, so that's great. I will figure that out while I ask you the much more easy topic of how we're going to solve world peace. So, so perhaps if we ask with Dr. Ikpe over there, and you have about 5 minutes, and then we can.
Okay, so just to be clear, we're starting with the point on the importance of elite bargains and that sort of thing. Is that?
Well, that's part of it.
Right?
Yes, the issue of what constitutes, what drives progress, and I suppose that's part of the question. Yeah, for sure.
No, thanks very much. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me. No, I think this is a very pertinent point. If I start with this particular one, this notion of the importance of elite bargains and the extent to which wider citizens' voices, matter, which matters more. I mean, I think what is very clear is that it's certainly not a situation of an either-or, right? And I think if we link that to other questions that I have, on these issues about the links between the short-term solutions and the long-term solutions, one could see the significance of elite bargains as being quite short-term, something to ensure the peace in the immediate future, and a discussion around the involvement of the broader citizenry as something we have to think about for the longer term. So that's a general idea about how I think this discourse has tended to develop. I would say, first of all, I think on all of these issues, we have to think very much about the particular context in question. So I think it's not always the case that you have elite bargains as the most important factor for the short term, and the idea that we can work our way into engaging the broader citizenry. One reason for that is also that I think there's an assumption that elites are always at some level, very detached from the broader citizenry, and that's not always the case. I mean, quite often, the reason that they have this higher level of influence is also down to the fact that they have a particular constituency that they are working for. And this generally is part of the wider citizenry. A lot of my work has been, I've looked a lot at Nigeria, and I know part of the mandate of this panel, I think, is also to draw more broadly on our experiences. And, there, for instance, I think if we were to say we treat these two spaces as being different, I think we'd run into some problems. For instance, many here may be aware of the conflict going on in northeastern Nigeria. Now, while many will argue that the origins of that are actually in political elite bargainings, that's the crux of the origin of that conflict, it's quite clear that that's run away from that original cause. And now you have the broader citizenry making their voices heard, whether or not you're interested in hearing them. And they are using the form of voice that they feel is going to get the most attention. So I think there you have a clear example of where these two are not situations we should treat as separate or as different. Again, I reiterate my point about the fact that context is very important. I'm not saying that this would apply everywhere, but if I start with a particular context, then I think the approach that one needs to think about more deeply becomes quite apparent. And in a similar light, I think a conflict that seems a bit more quiet, but I dare say is not quiet at all, the situation in the Niger Delta, which, there are a lot of risks and a lot of noises we're hearing now, especially as we get to a heated period in Nigeria's political calendar, the fact that you have elections coming up next month. And there again, you see an intricate, very, very intricate relationship between political elites and the broader citizenry. So the idea that you have, in fact, many would argue that the very crux of the conflict in the Niger Delta was about the interaction between, broader citizenry. Now, people may disagree as to whether the militant groups constitute broader citizenry, but I would say they do. They're part of the voices there. I mean, they are members of society that found that their voices were not being heard, and this is how they've, could say, chosen or decided they will be heard. And in that, members of the political elite decided, actually, we can find a way to reposition ourselves in the broader political landscape. So it's not a straightforward, easy answer, but I think that's just the point. It's not a straightforward, easy answer at all. My big point there would be that context matters, and I think in many cases, separating these two groups, I question the extent. I mean, I know from what we heard earlier, from these particular case studies at this particular time, that's something else to bear in mind, the temporal nature of the research that was carried out. The reflections are that, especially from what we heard about East Timor, the place of elite bargaining has been very important to the qualified peace situation we see. So I certainly don't want to put my argument forward as a blanket situation. Let me see. Just to make sure I'm still staying on point, what was the other main point I needed to address with this?
I think you have touched very nicely on the question of how the elites relate to citizens. I think there were broader, and you've touched about the short term and the long term. I think there were broader questions also about, where the crux of progress lies, if it's at the local level or the national level, regional level, or international level. But
Thank you.
You don't need to worry too much about it, because there's plenty of other opportunity to come in, and I think what you have provided is really good so far, and I think we need to perhaps move on to the. Is that okay?
Yeah.
All right. So now we move on to Oliver.
Thanks very much, Alina, and first of all, thank you to ODI and to you and colleagues for having invited me here. It's a great pleasure to be on this panel, and also thanks to Lisa, if she's still with us, for all of this. I like particularly this project that colleagues have been working on because progress is such a horrible word, right? Progress is where we all cringe and have sleepless nights over. And what on earth is progress, and how do we know it when we see it, right? And then it was the other word that goes with it is the one that we heard earlier, success. And some of my colleagues at the CCDP in Geneva and I were also involved in the 10-year review of the peace-building architecture in New York now, and this, that, the other. And always, what is the success of peace-building, right? It's the one that we always have a big issue. And it's the one, often in a way, it's also the elephant in the room. It's the one we try to shy away from. So what I like about this project is that it actually puts it in the title, Security Progress, right? It's courageous, because it gets us to talk about things that we usually try to avoid because we don't really know and what have you. So I like that. And I want to take that as a starting point, just maybe to kick us off here, to make a couple of perhaps slightly more conceptual points about some of the main concepts that the project is using. Now, I was flying through a North American airport recently, and you know when you go through passport control, or rather you're nicely queuing up in front of passport control, there's a big sign up, and it says, for your own safety and security, please switch off your mobile phone, right? So there seems to be, at least in their minds, a distinction between safety and security that we might want to unravel a little bit further, because I think both words are being used in what we heard and in the project, and they're related in all kinds of ways to violence and to conflict. And I perhaps just quite provocatively want to say three things about this. The first is, you might find quite a few occasions in which personal safety is not directly related or positively related to levels of violence, right? I can think of situations where people feel rather safe, but we would say, oh my God, there's lots of violence going on, because people might have various perceptions of this. Now again, Timor-Leste was one of the case studies. I was involved in a few years ago for the World Bank, trying to undertake household surveys on security perceptions in the country for their urban violence report 2011. And what we found was remarkable, because a lot of people in the neighborhoods were, what they thought was violence was, you know, the police coming in, youth throwing stones at UN vehicles and stuff getting burnt, and this kind of public style mayhem in whatever localized and ritualized form it might be. Whereas something that we would, you know, definitely perhaps think about as violence, for instance, in one neighborhood, my driver was having a meltdown because I said, oh, no, they lobbed somebody's head off yesterday, and we're going to talk to these people. I said, excuse me, what is it? And so there was apparently this kind of, you know, family, clan-based violence, that what we would call violence, from some family dispute that was resolved in a very vigilantist way. But that was not necessary, that didn't come up as factors influencing my personal safety if I am somebody living in that neighborhood. So again, I'm very careful about the kind of claims I'm making here, but just to throw it out there that personal safety is not necessarily only about the levels of public violence that we witness or not. And again, I think the colleague, if she's still here, doing gender and sexual-based violence, domestic violence is another one like that. Timor-Leste is a country that has lots and lots, apparently, problems on that scale. Does that contribute positively to people's perceptions of their safety walking through streets? And how do we get to grips with that, even as a researcher? Come to your third question, in terms of how do we research this, I don't know. And again, to say, you can also think of the opposite. You can find examples where statistically levels of violence and crime have been going down, but one very mediatized event has made everyone feel terribly insecure, and when you run another security perception survey, everyone says, oh my God, I can't live here anymore, and I can't take my kids to school, and what have you. So again, to what extent can we, what is the kind of evidence base on which we are trying to make sense of something we call, personal safety, personal security? My second point then is related then to how we consider and how we conceive of security progress. And I think this really goes back, and Lisa said it nicely as well now in her remarks, back to the fundamental tension we have within liberalism as such, right? Between individual freedom on the one hand and some sort of social order that we need to generate on the other, right? So your personal safety is perhaps part of that individual freedom side of things, right? I want to be able to be free from threats to my existence, right? That's the whole human security concept, in order for me to get on doing what I'm doing in society. But then society also needs to have some sort of institutions and structures in order to do what it does. So when we say then security progress, what do we mean, right? There are lots of CCTV cameras all around London. Is that security progress, right? I might be living in states, and this is where I think Lisa's point about illiberal peace building is so apt. We might say, right, for the sake of security, we are willing, at least in the short term, that gets us back to the short versus long term, we are willing to do all kinds of things that might not necessarily work with that are compatible with our liberal peace building paradigm, right? In order to have progress in something we call security. And I think that's something really we need to think about. Mexico, right? Self-defense forces. Nigeria actually as well. Now in northern Nigeria, communities are getting together and generating and organizing self-defense forces to fight Boko Haram because they are not relying or cannot rely on the Nigerian army. Is that security progress? It's perhaps a open question, depends on from what angle you're looking at. The state might not necessarily want, the Mexican state might have an issue with lots of self-defense forces, perhaps. So again, I think it's worth thinking a little bit along those lines. And my maybe last point at this stage is perhaps this normative agenda that is always part and parcel of how we think about security. It seems to be today that more security is always better than less, right? We need more security. That's a good thing. And it's quite remarkable because that's a very new discourse. 20, 30 years ago, we didn't think of security in those terms. Not only was it a very national state security type discourse, but this idea that security is something we need, and therefore for peace building we need to have progress in security, is a very 21st century or late 20th, early 21st century discourse. And I think that securitization element that is part and parcel of that is again something we might want to bring up. And last but not least, perhaps also the commodification of security that comes with it. And here some of our colleagues, I'm thinking now Rita Abramson and Mike Williams, for instance, and others, have looked at the way, when you have a plethora of security providers, not least private security companies, and that have completely outpaced public law and order providers. And obviously they themselves have an interest in telling you need more of whatever it is they're selling. So they will always say more security is needed, but you are living in a very insecure and unsafe environment, right? So already the way that discourse is shaped by certain actors, again, we can unpack this in terms of Liberia and Timor-Leste a little bit later on as well, I think is something we can think about later. So anyway, so those are my three little points to start us off.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Sorry about having to send you a little paper. All right, so Mark, over to you for 5 minutes.
Okay, thanks very much. And again, sort of echoing the views, thanks very much for having me here. I thought a couple of weeks ago when I started this new job, I'd been given a real challenge of trying to set up a £1 billion fund in 11 and a half weeks. But I think trying to solve world peace in 5 minutes is probably a little bit more difficult. So it's all relative, and I'm pleased that there are bigger challenges out there. So just in terms of the question, really, what factors drive security progress in countries emerging from conflict and the sub-questions, I won't repeat what others have said, which I very much agree with. I think just taking this first one, I think Lisa's asked us quite an interesting question here around are local, national, regional or international factors more important for achieving security progress. I think is interesting in itself and worth dwelling on. I think the implication behind the question, and again, I think probably one of the conceits that certainly we make in the international community is assuming that process is linear, number one, and often top down, so international, then down to national, regional and local. But equally that those things are all homogenous. And I think as we've already touched upon, I'd probably, rather than drawing a nice one-page PowerPoint slide, as I'm sure the National Security Council and others would like, I think if you were going to try and draw or map the relationships between those four levels, it would be much more akin to something like a Jackson Pollock painting. I think you're talking about a really complex mishmash of factors there that need to be continually assessed, and the relationships and the dynamics between them are changing. I very much agree with Dr. Ipe there that there is a real challenge, particularly in most conflict environments, between national level issues that are played out on a local level. So thinking about places like South Sudan would be a really good example to add to the ones that have already been given there. But also, conversely, the challenges of when you can try and align an international agenda that's been set for whatever particular reason down to a national level and a level of political will to try and promote security down to regional and local actors who very much share the same piece. So perhaps to provide two contrasting examples there from my own experience, I'd pick probably sort of Sierra Leone as an example in which up to a point this worked relatively well, and somewhere like Libya or South Sudan where it didn't. I think sort of taking Sierra Leone first, it's probably a good example really of what can be achieved in terms of progress if those various different rapidly moving and regularly changing parts can align at least for a temporary period of time. And I'd probably stress, as is evidence of what's going on in the country now, that was a temporary period. I think when you do have a situation where an international community, as it was, I think in 2002, that was still very much bearing the guilt and the brunt of some ineffective interventions in the 1990s, recognised that in some ways the international conflict architecture was at risk if what was seen as a relatively small, probably erroneously, and relatively simple, definitely erroneously, set of security challenges couldn't be engaged with more productively. When you had, I think, a government who again very much shared a perspective that enough was enough, and there was a need to try and address some of the mistakes in the country that had led to a complete divorce between, if that social contract in terms of the provision of security between state and society. And then I think at a local and to a certain extent a regional level, a range of different actors who in various different shapes and forms were trying to provide security and access to justice in what was quite a chaotic environment. I think if you can try and get that, as I said, that in a moving system, almost I suppose a bit akin to those arcade machines where you try and get the pinball to try and go down into the slot, but all of the different bits are moving around. If you can try and take advantage of those opportunities and try and link some multilateral activity with bilateral activity, there is a fair amount that can be done. But I think the real challenge, and certainly I can echo this from being involved from the British government perspective, is making sure that in whatever planning or whatever activity takes place, that's constantly being checked and reassessed based on what is happening both bottom up and top down. So recognising that at certain times the politics may not necessarily be conducive to the types of challenges that are faced, and is the need then to in some ways compromise or to acquiesce and recognise that what you might be asking either publicly or privately leaders to do is not possible. They don't have the constituencies or the legitimacy to undertake those activities. Or on what occasion is a situation in which those individuals themselves don't necessarily want those outcomes, and at what stage then is pressure applied in different levels. Likewise, I think at what stage and this links to one of the second questions there, at what stage do local actors become involved, and at what stage do their voices matter, and is there a gradation in terms of when they matter? I very much agree with Dr. Ekpe's point there in the fact that the context is key, but I think it's really important for all of us, particularly in the world that we live in now, is to recognise that the state doesn't, and in certain cases has never had that monopoly over the provision of security and justice. People do have a choice, particularly in a whole range of contexts, both in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere. People exercise that choice on a daily basis, and to assume that what we want and what we think as an international actor is what citizens in those countries want is a very much a false conceit. And I think the real challenge is that if too much focus is spent on those elite bargains, which I would argue ultimately, certainly at the international level, do have a critical level of importance, if one is not looking at that sort of rotating orbit between state, the elites and the populations, and trying to make sure that those stars are continually in geopolitical alignment, then one will come unstuck quite quickly. Your political settlement or even your peace agreement, sometimes those two things are very different, will not necessarily be sustainable if it doesn't have that buy-in from the population and they're pursuing their own security options and considerations. And I think just to bring back to the other example I talked about, somewhere like Libya would be a very good example of that. I think you had a very, very strong consensus from some members of the international community of what needed to be done, both at a geopolitical level, but also at a national level. But if underneath that you had very different power bases, very different views from different parts of the country, and various different ethnic and other breakdowns in terms of what good security and what good justice looked like, who was going to provide it and who would benefit and who would lose out, no amount of geopolitical negotiations are ever going to bear fruit. And then just in the very short time I know I've got left to avoid being given a little ticket there. Just in terms of the short-term and longer-term piece, I mean, I had some questions really with the way this question was phrased. It was quite interesting, I think, that one of the questions was how should countries manage these potential trade-offs, in the fact that I think one of the unfortunate realities in many environments at the moment is that countries themselves are often not sufficiently empowered to make those trade-offs. Sometimes these trade-offs are being made above those countries. Sometimes the political actors who are being placed under quite a lot of pressure to think about these trade-offs lack either the resources or the legitimacy or the political capital to do so. And I think one of the real challenges that we as certainly an international community need to consider quite hard is that often we present certain trade-offs to countries without really thinking through whether they are able to make the decisions that we would like them to make. And again, I think drawing back from personal experience in Sierra Leone again, and I know just seeing Garth over there, he was also involved in this. A real challenge between asking a government to spend a huge amount of time and effort on trying to effectively build an enabling environment, because I think security at that stage was seen very much as an enabler rather than an outcome, coming back to the point that Oliver made there, to try and spend a lot of time asking a government to try and work with a range of international actors to deliver that outcome, and then suddenly saying, thanks very much for that, now you not only need to consolidate that outcome, you also now need to deliver a peace dividend, and by the way, you'll do that with the same resources, or actually in reality probably less resources because the peacekeeping mission has transitioned, etc. That's a really tough ask for any country to do, and I think in the international community we need to think a lot better if we are thinking about longer term and short term and longer term security progress, about making sure our own planning cycles, our own programming, our own resource allocations and our own I suppose skills and expertise that exist in those countries are better informed by the dynamic on the ground and better informed by the local populations and the actors within it. And I know we'll come back to that when we talk to research gaps. So.
Well, yes, and also when we talk about more specifically about what the international community can do. Thank you very much, the three of you, for very insightful comments. I think obviously it comes across very strongly that context does matter, and I really like the point that Dr. Ikpe made about how elites are linked to citizens and whether or not this provides a possibility for progress. Again, I am thinking of the Mexico case. Mexico was ravaged by a really rather violent revolution in the 1910s, 1920s, and after that I think was very successful in bringing together sustainable peace for 70 plus years, and it was very much done on the basis of an elite bargain, divvy up and share and co-opt and buy off, but also in a very inclusive model where people at least felt that they had a stake. Whereas, for example, if you think about Guatemala and what has happened there, I think it had perhaps the single most inclusive peace process witnessed in the past 40 years or so, where everybody was involved in some way or another with very strong support from the international community, and yet there's such a delinking between the elites and citizens that really has not borne any kind of fruitful prospects for sustainable peace. And I think this point on Guatemala touches on the other question that I had for the panel, which is, what happens when the state is no longer the main actor, one of the leading actors in sustaining and promoting violence, and violence gets decentralized in a way, let's say, and organized activity, criminal gangs or what have you, take over. And I think Guatemala is a very vivid example of that, as is Mexico, I have to say. But it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on this, in post-conflict settings that are so porous and where international organized crime can easily infiltrate. Is this an issue? Is this something that we should be worried about? Maybe we start with Oliver. I'll do and then we do that.
Thank you. Maybe just perhaps 2-3 words on that. I mean, first of all, just to come back to the elite bargains, I think one thing to say on those is they're also urban elite bargains. And I think that both case studies show that very well. It happens in Dili, it happens in Monrovia, and we can think of lots of other examples, right? There's a bunch of people who amongst themselves, and they know how to write good project proposals for the World Bank, and because they've studied at Harvard, and there is a certain elite that does what it does, and that might be completely disconnected with the hinterlands and whatever part we're looking at. So already there, it's an elite bargain, but it's an elite that does not necessarily represent large parts of the population. And I think that's really where then the issue starts. To what extent does the state even have control in any sort of meaningful sense on public law and order provision on the territory as such? And we can see also the amount of the new kind of initiatives that are being taken to do something about more devolution of powers, local security committees. Your government's been involved in some of this as well, trying to find out new innovative ways of making sure there is some sort of local community level representation. Because I think what we're struggling with is to make that link between the international and the local, right? And peace building is like that too. We have lots of great examples of community-based peace building initiatives, grassroots, doing stuff in the neighborhood and what have you. And then we have our big international peace building debate, right? But what happens in between is what we're all struggling with. And precisely because in between all kinds of things happen, right? So we try to use new vocabulary. We talk of hybrid political orders now to try, almost, because we're running out of ways of observing and categorizing what it is we see there. But I certainly think it's worth thinking about what happens in that intermediate level, and I can say a few more things about that later in terms of between the state and the citizen, what institutions, what structures might you need, might you want, that could provide more of a link between the top-down and the bottom-up kind of approaches. Anyway, I'm talking too much. I have to stop.
Yeah.
Very effective.
Thank you. Thanks for that. I think that's a very interesting question. And I think, again, if we look, because I like the way you pose it, but I think it also presents this issue of having a plethora of non-state actors in the security setting as something that, has happened now or has happened in a particular situation. But in many of these contexts we refer to, and I think especially, I would say in many parts of West Africa, these are actually historical structures. You've always had a situation where for many parts, I think Mark had said this earlier, for many parts of the population, security is provided by non-state actors. The point was made earlier as to, is that security progress? And I think that's an interesting question to pose. And I would say, again, my mantra of context being very, very important, I think in some cases it is security progress because we finally come to a place where we recognize the actual situation. And instead of the pretense that state security forces are the ones, who should do all of this, we come to a place where we can say, actually, this is the reality. How can we make this come together? And in many contexts, there are attempts to try to make this work. I spoke of Boko Haram earlier. Actually, in northeastern Nigeria, there's the Civilian Joint Task Force. You'd mentioned this earlier, I think, as well. That is working with the state security forces. Now, that comes with its own challenges, because now you have to think of, what legitimacy do they have to carry out particular activities, and what happens, when they carry out extrajudicial killings, situations like that, and the risk that they face themselves. Because, for instance, we talk very much about gender-based violence in many of these contexts, but a particular element of gender-based violence in northeastern Nigeria presently has been the fact that young males in many of these spaces are killed because they're assumed to be part of the Civilian Joint Task Force. So there are many complexities around the way we address that. So it's not to say security progress, so we should be happy. No, of course, there are a lot of complexities about how we should move forward with engaging that. But I think it's progress to recognize that this is the system in place. How do we make it work? I know in the middle belt of Nigeria with the crisis in Jos, they are very, they're budding very clear structures of how young civilians work with the police to address violence in parts of Jos. I know I think it's progress when the state security forces themselves recognize their weaknesses and recognize where we might be able to work with society, and also recognize how we pool resources, but also how we engage those we're supposed to be protecting. I think it changes the narrative there a bit. Another aspect to this to this discussion, I think a very important element is this idea of the short term versus the long term. So, and for me, I think with my own background in development as well, I think the idea that we come to developmental issues after we address security issues is a huge problem, And I think especially in spaces like this, it must be understood that, where the state is having challenges addressing this plethora of non-state security actors or of outbreaks of violence, they're clearly, the point that's made about structural factors. They're major underlying structural factors. Many of them have been mentioned here. Poverty, again, if you speak about northern Nigeria, there's no way that is not a major cause of what we see. I mean, the regions that I've mentioned have the highest levels of youth unemployment, especially. So this is not something we should come to after. This must be something that is part and parcel of addressing these situations presently. Yeah, so those are the points I would make on that.
Thank you so much. Bart, do you want to come in with this?
Yes, absolutely.
Mutation of violence?
So yeah, just in terms of so my understanding is we're focusing on when the state is no longer the main actor in terms of violence. Is that where we're
Yes.
going to? Yeah. So, I mean, just I suppose a couple of thoughts really. I think certainly speaking from I suppose an international donor perspective, part of the challenge, I think there's a recognition that as you already alluded to, Alina, in a range of environments now, the state is no longer the main actor in terms of either the problems or in certain cases the solution. I think one of the big challenges the international community often has is that regardless of that initial point, the state often is the primary interlocutor, and certainly when one is working through a government, an international donor, there is that requirement to engage, obviously engage with the state itself and to respect that state sovereignty and et cetera, et cetera. And I think part of the real challenge there is then making sure that there is enough of an evidence base and enough of a dialogue to try and encourage those state actors and those state interlocutors with whom we're working, that they also have a common understanding of what the problem is. And invariably, I think I've certainly found from my experience in getting involved in quite a few security and justice sort of scoping and program design missions, etc., is that initially you will always be presented with what you want to hear, that the problem is one very much around lack of capacity and lack of training and lack of equipment and lack of money, etc., etc. And it takes a bit of time to build up relationships, but over time you can present solutions that say, well, actually, it doesn't look from the evidence that's being pointed to that they are really the problems. The problems are more fundamental. They're either ideological or political or social or cultural, etc. And most people, I think, particularly those with whom the political relationship exists, will acquiesce and acknowledge that. And the challenge in many ways is trying to encourage states to move from a position where, whether they be from the police or the intelligence services or the military, the natural desire of an end state is to be the primary provider of security, into recognising that actually the state's role might be slightly different. It might be about engaging and interfacing with a range of different security actors, but trying to bring some more common levels of accountability or consistency to the services provided, and acting as I suppose, an additional arbitrator between security disputes in recognition that one person's security or justice beneficiary may be somebody else's worst nightmare, and we've already heard some examples of that. And I think part of the challenge there, and I suppose this is the third point, is that we have, unfortunately, I think, and this has probably been exacerbated over the last decade or so, made an assumption that if there is a security problem in a particular country, it requires a security solution. And I don't think that is often the case. And I think your examples you were talking about, Alina, from Latin America, very much, I think, are the epitome of that. Many of these issues are social. They may be to do with the provision of services, the provision societal structures, the role of various different other types of institutions. And I think part of the trade-off, and this is linking to Ika's point there, is trying to recognise that the security community, for want of a better term, may play a role in contributing to analysis. They may play a role to contributing to an understanding of the problem. But it doesn't automatically follow that they need to be the primary actor in responding. And I think the challenge there is in many ways, I think, probably a bit of a compromise of the development community recognising that security and security challenges is a key part of the development agenda. And despite Claire Short saying that in 1996, not too far away from here, there is still, I think, a big ideological challenge to get that firmly embedded within the development community. And I think this year's post-2015 goals will also be another opportunity to put this on the table. But equally, I think there's a recognition amongst the security community that effectively drawing a huge circle around something saying this is a security issue and therefore nobody else can engage in it is equally part of the problem. And as always, it's the wonderful third way, isn't it? It's trying to recognise there is a Venn diagram there where security and development issues meet in the middle and require a slightly more innovative solution than perhaps we've provided to date.
Thank you. Is this on international?
Yeah, just one little follow-up on that. It's perhaps also the same with what is a post-conflict situation, right? You mentioned Guatemala. Today has far higher rates of homicide and armed violence than it ever had during the Civil War, right? Honduras constantly tops the list of world rates of homicide. So what is it about this post-conflict situation that is or is still pertinent for the kind of questions we're posing?
Well, and I think this now really nicely leads us to the other bigger question that we hope to address in the panel, which is really very specifically what the international community can do to help achieve progress in security in post-conflict or conflict-afflicted settings. We heard about international peacekeeping, as I was saying, SSR reforms and whether or not they have worked, whether it is important to have them just for form, but actually because they do provide some kind of idea of promoting peace, irrespective of whether or not they work in practice. And we have now heard about the different actors at the domestic level that are engaged with helping to secure peace, at the local level, informal actors, and how these may relate or not to the state, and how the international community in particular can help to support these less formal actors that do play an important role. And I think now also in terms of the conversation we've been having here, there are some real issues about what the how the international community defines these problems. And I actually want to say that progress is the use of progress is progress on the use of success, right? But how the international community defines this, what it expects, especially in the short term, which may be completely unrealistic, and how to tie that in more closely with long-term objectives, and also the point that Mark was beginning to elaborate on here, which is clearly the security, the need for peace and stability and security is part and parcel of a much broader development agenda, and how does the international community engage with that sort of, I don't want to say spectrum, because these things are always complex and nonlinear, but if there is a wider development agenda that needs to be addressed, how does this fit in? So I know, Mark, that you were touching on some of these already, so if you don't mind kicking us off, that would be great. I would ask you to be, all of you, to use about 3 to 4 minutes very precisely, so that we can then invite the audience for a bit of a discussion.
No, that's fine. So maybe I'll just make one point against each of the sort of the sub points in this area. I mean, I think I'd probably start off by saying that very much of the mantra of this panel, I think the context is key, and I think the role that international actors can play in helping to achieve security progress can be both positive and negative, depending on the circumstances of those international actors, the timings of the interventions, and in many ways, I suppose the all-important, if this was an element of a slightly sort of chaotic relay race, really, I suppose, making sure that the right transitions within the lexicon of the international community's conflict and peace and security toolbox are instigated at the right time. The analogy I've been using quite recently is that perhaps we probably need to move away from the idea of separate tools for separate issues and move towards something a bit more akin to a Swiss Army knife of having the same set of interventions that can be used for multiple purposes depending on the context. But I think, sort of to elaborate on that, I think international peacekeeping, in my view, certainly at least, can have both a positive and on occasions a potentially detrimental contribution to security progress. And just to elaborate on that, I think that certainly from the experiences since probably the start of the 21st century, I think there have been some really positive examples of which very large international peacekeeping missions can play a positive role, not necessarily in delivering security progress as an outcome in themselves, going back to my earlier point, but almost acting as an enabler in which other either bilateral actors or governments or local communities, or in many cases combinations of all three, can actually start to try and take a level of ownership and responsibility and identification of the problems and the potential solutions therein. So again, just to go back to some examples I've been using, I still, and I suppose I would say this, wouldn't I, saw that the UNAMSIL peacekeeping mission in Sierra Leone was a good example of that. I think it was in place in its sort of latter iterations for long enough to provide that umbrella for the government of Sierra Leone to identify what it was it wanted to do and to try and then start to implement it, but not long enough to transfer responsibility for security and justice provision away from either the population or the government or the international actors to the peacekeeping mission itself. And I suppose just to elaborate on that point, one of the real challenges I think for peacekeeping missions, if they stay in place for too long, particularly with very similar mandates, is that it can become a bit of a sort of a self-licking lollipop, I think, in which governments themselves will manage to devolve responsibility for difficult political decisions to that mission, or argue that they have a bit less space than perhaps they might do. I think linked to that then, in terms of positive and negatives for the contribution security sector reform can make to security progress, is again a lot depends on how security sector reform is perceived, both by the governments in question, the donors, and then the recipients, the citizens and the population. I think where it works well, and I think I only caught the tail end of this, but I think this was something Craig was saying in the context of the Liberia case study, is that as long as people recognise that security sector reform is a fundamentally political process, it's effectively the negotiation of a social contract between states, societies, elites, between how security and justice are provided in a particular context, and how effectively those services are provided with the consent and the acquiescence of those receiving them. I think if it's seen as such, it can make a hugely beneficial contribution to security progress, both in terms of increasing accountability of those providers, both state and non-state, improving the quality of the services that are delivered, but also delivering a whole set of wider efficiencies and clarity in terms of structures, systems, finances, budgets, etc., and the power that comes with them. I think where it's done badly, and I think there are many examples of that as well, it's seen as a very supply-driven technocratic process, whereby people judge success in terms of security progress as to whether legislation is in place, policies, structures and systems, without actually thinking what those structures and systems are for, or what they're actually providing, or whether they are what people actually want and have articulated. And I think that, again, is the real challenge, particularly in an international context, is trying to make sure that a deeply political issue doesn't get reduced to its technical constituent parts, which is always a danger, I think. And then probably the first point there, in terms of the final one, is the how can the international community support local actors and informal practices. I think the essence of the point I very much agree with. I think it's really important that the international community does give recognition to local actors, informal practices, give support, works with what works, to use another slightly, I suppose, tired phrase. But I think two things I'd say. I think number one is that it's really important that any support that's provided to those actors and systems is done with the acquiescence of those actors and systems. So, using some experience of mine from places like Pakistan, I think an extremely effective and legitimate process can be ruined by international funding or a very overt, either erroneously or otherwise, perception that somehow something that is providing the needs for particular citizens is now doing so with a political agenda that's not necessarily always aligned to those actors in question. And I suppose going back to one of the things I said earlier, I still think that one of the real value adds that the international community can provide, and I know this moves on to the final question, is really understanding how those systems work and for whom, and making sure that the state, wherever possible, understands what is out there at the moment, and to encourage that interface between state and society relations, rather than trying to position oneself on either side of that divide. I think the international community can hopefully act on occasions as a broker.
Edpa, can I now move to you for your thoughts on this question? And we'll
Thank you very much. So I think I'll respond to it on the security theme and on the development theme. So the point is really what international actors, what role they can play in all of this. I think I'll preface what I want to say by the fact that I put this forward, but I think I say this against the background of the fact that I see an international community, certainly the elite elements of it that are very much at the helm of a lot of decisions in this space, as having deeply embedded ideological and instrumental objectives at times. So sometimes some of these ideas get lost in that, and some of the engagement with contextual realities also get lost in that. So, for instance, I was actually, as part of the Conflict, Security and Development group, because now I'm with the African Leadership Center, as part of that, we were very involved in the SSR process in Liberia, working with the Governance Reform Commission out there, supported by DFID actually to do that work. And very much the mandate that we had in working with the Governance Reform Commission was to carry out a process-driven approach. So to carry out, a very broad survey about what security meant to people, about how they saw, what they would see as progress in that situation. But then with some other supporters of this process, this was seen as luxurious. So it's very interesting that the report on Liberia actually makes the point that SSR stands out as something that people reflect on, and especially the point about the lack of or the insufficient involvement of civil society actors, because that was I'm not surprised at all, because as part of that process, what happened in the end was the argument was being made that instead of this long process to write up a national security policy, there's no appetite for this, there's certainly no resources for this, and there's no time for this. We'll get some experts, and they will write it up. And, we'll deal with the other things later. And I think this draws the point also about the short-term versus long-term, because now we see reflection on very, very important issues around the role of veterans, for instance. And I think in the report I actually picked, and I think Pauline made the point earlier as well, the fact that this is something hankering about in people's minds. You still have these people around who have not been catered for. How do we address that? Now, this is something that a process-driven approach was supposed to be dealing with, but was short-circuited because the argument was that, this cannot be a priority. We need to deal with the short-term issue, the immediate issue now. So I think that throws up that point about short-term versus long-term. Again, if you're going to go back to the short-term problem, is it a losing situation to begin with? I want to move to the issue on the developmental factors here. And I think the international community needs to deal with and needs to engage very strongly is this continued subscription to the notion of liberal economic reforms as the response to successful reconstruction in post-conflict societies, but in general. And these are very ahistorical. The idea that many of these proposals that are put forward will drive the long-term development that we need to see to undermine the risk of further conflict. And I think in spite of evidence in this regard, we continue along this path. I think the recent situation with the Ebola crisis in this part of the world, a lot of it has been, fingers have been pointed at the fact that you've had very long periods of very minimal investment in health, in the health systems of these countries. And a lot of that has been very much linked to the liberal economic policies that say these are things that can't be afforded right now. We need to focus on macroeconomic stability. And so you have this situation that could, challenge very fragile contexts. So for me, I think these are two, very significant points we must take on board. Sorry, and attached to that is even this huge focus on foreign direct investment and natural resources. That this somehow is going to drive the change we want to see, where there's a lot of evidence that actually this can put many of these post-conflict environments at risk. I think there's a current situation with East Timor, with its own contention with Australia around this issue. And if we don't go back to the very foundational issues around building an indigenous private sector, building indigenous private capital, I think we're going to keep going back and forth on these issues and putting these societies at continued risk. So
Thank you very much. Oliver?
Yeah, perhaps just to echo what both my colleagues were saying, I think what we often see is that we'd like to believe that there is an international response to something, and that there is therefore also a legitimate national counterpart at the other side with whom one can do business, right? But in reality, you have, on the one hand, you have that wretched coordination and coherence debate about donors, both multilateral and bilateral, somehow coming together and being on the same page. And On the other side, you have the very natural also kind of institutional competition, the kind of bureaucratic decision-making procedures. All the political scientists in the room know what I'm talking about, right? The police wants to maximize the amounts of funding it receives versus the gendarmerie versus the military, etc., etc. So there's always that vying for power and a potential instrumentalization, perhaps then, of the international community, whatever we want to call that. And I think SSR is particularly an area where this is prone to happen. And again, I can think of Timor-Leste, I can think of Madagascar and others as well, where you have, on the one hand, you have New Zealand and Australia wanting to do, as part of their UNPOL mandate, community policing, neighborhood watch initiatives, and the very kind of Anglo-Saxon model, whereas the head of the police says, I need more capacity, I need big guns because I'm having daily standoffs with the military who are also patrolling the streets of Dili. Why? Right? External security, internal security, straight, right? But in a lot of these countries, you do have military forces on the streets. And already there, and with the gendarmerie, it just gets, in some places, it just gets even more difficult, right? And then you have even several types of, in parallel, several types of security sector reform happening. So again, East Timor is a great example. You have a focus on community policing on the one hand, and you have the National Republican Guard in Portugal doing riot control and making national police folks march around the bush all day. Completely different idea of what it is we need to do to the security sector. And I think that's really where a lot of the issues lies. The politics again involve the elite bargaining within the security sector itself, and the relationship to the donors. And again, what about the local actors? I would again plea for the middle ground of what do we have between the local community level, the neighborhood level in terms of the city, and the international level. Why does Dili have no mayor? Right? Why does the capital of East Timor have no mayor's office? Where's local government? Right? Where are those kind of initiatives? And there, just as a very last kind of bit of self-promotion here, we're at the CCDP, we're a founding member of the Geneva Peacebuilding Platform, and one of the things we're doing over the last year or so and continuing is we started a technical working group with UN Habitat and the UN office in Geneva on the confluence between urban safety and peacebuilding issues. The idea being precisely this, okay, the peace builder has this problem of linking up the international with the local, but there are lots of folks doing interesting stuff on that municipal level, on that local government level, on security structures working not with states, perhaps as the national counterpart, but with city mayors, with other local and municipal institutions. And perhaps that's part of maybe where we can try and link up, both in terms of the expertise that's happening and maybe also in terms of the challenges we keep facing as we try to merge those two levels. So,
but those are still formal government structures that you're referring to, right? When you talk about mayors and municipal government.
Yes, but I think they are, but I think they also involve a lot of citizen groups, a lot of community groups, a lot of mobilization of, right? In that sense, the urban studies say, the city is maybe where a lot of the mayhem might happen, but it's also where political change happens. And we've seen that recently again. It happens in the city. So this is also where you can have perhaps positive, kind of more citizen-led approaches that do resonate in one way or another, perhaps with the kind of representative institutions that might be there or that might be established in the process.
Thank you. I think what I'll do now is open up the floor for a bit of a conversation with the audience and leave a little bit of time at the very end to let the speakers chew over this question of what the research gaps are or what areas of innovation we can sort of delve into. But I wanted to invite the public, and my parents may not have solved world peace, but I have solved the problem of this thing. And nobody is asking me any questions, although I do know that we're live and we're tweeting, and the hashtag again is SecProg, right? # #SecProg. So I saw a question, hand over there. Please remember that you're on the public record, and if you can, please identify yourself, and that'll be great. Thank you.
Hello. Is it on? Yes. My name is Leslie Cole. I'm just a member of the public. I've worked in some post-conflict situations, but more public financial management. And I really enjoyed your panel. Thank you very much. My question is around I guess, looking in the future potential post-conflict countries and how they're related to, shall we say, ideologies which currently aren't engaging with the donor community. I work in Somaliland, Afghanistan, places like that. So getting those people to the table, trying to learn from this, where you get this cohesive group together that wants to put something in for the security progress of the post-conflict. How do you manage those negotiations when actually right now those conversations aren't able to happen?
Thank you. The gentleman here.
Thank you very much. My name's Will Taylor. I work for BBC Media Action. I had a question about talking about you've discussed both sort of linkages top to bottom and also the role of society and the state, and a bit of an emphasis on particularly in the two case studies on elite bargaining, at least in the first instance. And those two countries I don't know an awful lot about, but I imagine they don't have a great mass media penetration or a great sort of connectivity between people. And I wanted to ask the panel's reflections on whether post-conflict and peace processes have changed. Are they fundamentally different in societies which have closer linkages and there's a higher media penetration? And if so, how?
Thank
you. Good afternoon. My name is Anthony Sequeira. I'm a master's student at the LSE. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. I wanted to ask, with regards to developments in post-conflict situations, we're seeing an increased relationship between military actors international military actors and development practitioners, where the military seems to be using development as a tool for short-term military gains. I wanted to ask, to what extent do you think that sometimes undermines long-term development goals? An example being provincial development teams in Afghanistan. And do you think that there should be increased coordination between the military and development practitioners, or clear separation between military and development to resolve this kind of issue?
And actually, my question's kind of linked. I'm Aoife McCullough from ODI, and I guess I wanted to draw attention to what's been increasingly discussed by some authors, such as Mark Duffield and Severine Otaser, and it's about how peace builders and peace actors work in these environments. And I think Severine's example from DRC, where she looks at the separation between development workers, peace builders, and the local community, and how that prevents building up trust and deep relationships between workers and the local community, and how that damages the peace process, and also how we tend to latch onto certain understandings of what is the problem, and in DRC it was so gender-based violence was considered a huge issue, but in the process of drawing attention to that, what the international community was doing was encouraging NGOs to over-report gender-based violence, and in the process to detract attention from other problems.
Thanks very much. I was quite very interested in the sort of commentary on the elite bargains and representation, and I noticed that Mark used the term social contract, and I often wonder if social contract isn't a better terminology than political settlement, precisely because it does kind of suggest this notion of a bargain between people and the state. And it seems to me that when you look at situations where we've had the kind of elite bargains that you were talking about, Oliver, and that you were mentioning but were saying were not always the case, which are elite bargains which are just about the elite And even if they have constituencies, they're not constituencies they necessarily have to be responsive or accountable to afterwards. So you can have elites that represent constituencies, but represent them because of possibly tribal or ethnic allegiances rather than because it's a strong accountability relationship. It seems to me that the research gap lies, I completely agree with your first point that it's not either or. It seems to me that the research gap lies in, if it's not either or, what type of elite societal configuration does deliver political settlements or some sort of political arrangement that lasts. And I think we've seen a whole slew of countries, probably South Sudan being the most recent, where there was some sort of moment, and it went on only for 3 years, and then it came apart at the seams very, very badly. And Chuck Call's book talks a lot about settlements that have come apart very badly at the seams. So I'd like to ask the panel their views about that. And then I just want to say one thing about gender-based violence. I'm sorry, I always have to say this. Sorry, Aoife. But it doesn't distract. We sort of, it's 50% of the population. If we're handling gender-based violence, we're doing the appropriate thing. It's not a distraction from other problems. It actually highlights quite a lot of them. And I think there's a lot of discourse right now where we're kind of saying, oh, well, because we have to focus on gender-based violence and the security agenda, it's distracting from important issues. And of course, people always say that about stuff that involves women. And I just have to register a slight objection and alternative point of view. But my apologies for that. Thanks.
Thank you. I think I shall now turn to the panel to give you a chance to discuss and digest, because there were some really, really interesting questions about sort of unrecognized or difficult to deal with actors in Afghanistan and Somaliland, for example, the role of the media we had here, the relationship between development and militarization, whether there should be more or less coordination. And I think you touched on what Aoife was saying as well about peace building and development and how they interlink. And then this question that Sheena was raising about whether and how political settlements may differ from the social contract, and what kinds of state-society configurations lead you to better articulate social contracts.
It's what kind of elite society configuration that's going to deliver something that lasts. We need, as you said very helpfully in the beginning,
and I think my audience there got scared by the fact that I couldn't read the iPad, but nobody has said anything, so sorry. So I will leave the floor to all of you. Maybe we can start with the order that we had at the beginning, and put you on the hot seat, Ekma, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you. I want to echo what you said, first of all, about gender-based violence, that it's easy to see when you see reporting and media that seems to focus on what looks to be one issue, that there's a lot of focus on that to the detraction of other issues. But again, I'll echo what you're saying about the fact that if you look at what a lot of feminist scholars address, is the fact that this is really an entry point. What we could do is use this as a tool, right, to begin to think about what security, what development, what all of these things mean for those that are affected by these issues, because they're underlying reasons why you see such high levels of gender-based violence in these societies, that not simply down to a certain group wanting to harm another group. There are other structural factors that drive this. So that's what I would say on that. But I think you also said that very clearly. On what type of elite society configuration? Good heavens! I wish I knew. I wish I knew is what I would say. I think we have to. It seems like a cop-out, but again, this notion of the particular situation that we are referring to comes to light again. I don't think there are easy answers to this, or we can say there is a framework and this is how it will be. And if you have, this sort of arrangement, then things should be fine. I think many people have thought that, and you put that in place and actually find out a few years later actually it doesn't work like that. And maybe sometimes it works for a while, because at that particular time, that is what you need in place. Because even the I hear what you say about representing constituencies that you're not accountable to, but it's also how we think about accountability. You're accountable in certain ways. It may not be in a formal political way or within a formal political system, but quite often you're there because, you're there because there's certain groups propping you up, but that may not always last. That may not always last. That will alter, that will change, that keeping one's ear to the ground is what I will say, to see when we need to readjust some of this before things fall apart. Easier said than done, I guess. But again, the situation I'd mentioned before, and the Niger Delta, some will say it has worked for now, because we haven't seen a major return to conflict as we saw. But, you say it has worked, and it's also, what do we mean by it has worked? You haven't seen any serious kind of development progress in that part of the country, but you haven't seen a return to violence. So what are we even positing a situation as having worked? Is it a case of you have very high levels of poverty, people that don't have access to, economic livelihood, but they're not killing each other, so that's okay? I mean, is that okay? I don't think, I wouldn't say that it's enough to say, that is okay, for instance. What else shall I take on? The point on unrecognized actors, I mean, that's a tough one, but a very important one, I think. Again, the part of the world that I work on, if I think of the Boko Haram challenge, for instance, the roles of Islamic scholars in northern Nigeria has been very underplayed. The fact that you've had, some major voices who have said, actually, this interpretation of Islam and the use of Islam for this purpose, doesn't work. It's absolutely has no foundation. We haven't heard any of those voices, but they're very, very strong in that part of the country. And many of them have actually suffered because they've spoken up. And I think that could have been a very important space, especially at the initial stages of this problem. That could have been a very important set of voices to think about. And I think these groups always exist. And it's about keeping, eyes open, and it's about broad engagement. This is why there's lots of focus on the elites, on particular groups that are the loudest. But in actual fact, there are a lot more players in these situations. So I don't have a clear answer there, I'm afraid. But just to concur with you that there are these groups. I've identified this one, but in this situation, it wasn't engaged, and I think we might have seen, slightly better situation if this group was engaged earlier on. I think now it's getting a bit late in the day. Let me leave it now and see what my colleagues.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do you want to jump in?
I don't want to. Okay, go on. Let me go then. So I suppose, just taking the questions in the order that they came. I mean, I agreed very much with what Eka said there in terms of the first question about how to engage with the non-engaged. I think I'd probably say a couple of things, really. I think, elaborating on what I said earlier, I think there's two things for me. One is being very clear that even if the issues might relate to security and progress, the security community is not always the solution. And also, I think security is inevitably not always the entry point. Often communities don't see many of their issues as being framed within that security lens in the way that perhaps the international community or the national actors do. And I can certainly sort of say, just from my own experience, that one of the things that we're perhaps not very good at, certainly at the international level, going back to using the right tools for the job, in that, if you want to discuss politics, getting politicians involved is a far better way of doing it than using technocrats or bureaucrats. And I've seen, certainly from my time in West Africa, some masterful pieces of discussion that have taken place by bringing in political actors who use a credibility from their former, or in certain cases their current experience, and an empathy with the difficulties that certain people have at a local or a national level that would never be replicated by anyone from the international community, that can really bring these issues home. Using that, just as an aside on the security sector, I've worked very closely with, as indeed with King's College, with the African Security Sector Network, and there are a whole range of people there who have a massive amount of credibility just by being either practitioners or engaged in particular issues, that again holds a level of credibility and a level of respect with recipient actors in a way that, again, more traditional donors or practitioners wouldn't. I think trying to use community representation and community representatives as much as possible, but caveating that point, I made earlier, that one has to respect their space and their credibility and their ability to not lose that credibility by being seen attached to an international agenda. And probably just the final thing on that question is using faith-based actors. I think the famous thing that was mentioned by Alistair Campbell, whatever it was, about 10, 15 years ago, of not doing God, it's always struck me as being a slightly, if you look at the way the rest of the world is, a secular society is very much the exception rather than the rule in the Western world, and thinking about how to use and work with faith-based actors a bit more constructively is also really quite important. On the media question and the differences, I think it's a really good question. I think the sort of two things I'd say. One, as I suppose, a slight nuance there. One, I don't think it's fair to assume that in environments in which there is not a large media penetration, that connectivity isn't there. And I think that certainly I've seen certainly from my time in West Africa, the amazing ability that how a rumour can spread halfway around the world before the truth has put its boots on. And I think that you get a perfect storm a lot of the time between many governments, both international and national, being hugely resistant to the idea of communication and not comfortable with doing it. Trying now to work in a world in which, as a result of Facebook, Twitter, all sorts of other things, even more local initiatives, radio, etc., stories can get out incredibly fast. I think it's been really interesting actually with Sheila in the room. She'll remember this, that Stabilisation Unit had a very large Stratcoms effectively capacity that over a few years eroded because no one really wanted to utilise it. It's amazing how much that is now coming back again. My main concern, I think, and this is, I suppose, again, a nuance, is that strategic communication specialists tend to provide the mechanism for communication really effectively. They can't necessarily provide the content. And one of the things that we continue to struggle with is trying to persuade governments and other organisations around the world of the real importance of perception management and not be fearful of the idea of engaging with their publics. And often, in many cases, people are quite pleasantly surprised if someone from government, I'd probably try and include myself in this, will come along and try and be relatively honest and frank with people about the issues and challenges, rather than presenting something that says all is fine when clearly the environment suggests somewhat otherwise. The question around military actors and development practitioners, that's a really, really live debate at the moment, and I think, to be honest, it's going to be one that's going to be fairly carefully fought and sought through in the next Strategic Defence and Security Review after the general election. My view on it, as someone who spent the last sort of 10, 12 years doing civil military working, is that separation is not really either an option or advisable. I think if you end up with two communities that don't understand each other and make all sorts of base assumptions about either party, it's a recipe for disaster in the inevitable likelihood of the need for a civil military response to a particular crisis or challenge. I think what does need to happen is that to give our military colleagues credit, they spend a huge amount of time and effort in trying to understand the civilian bureaucracy and how they dock into it as effectively a tool, a service provider of foreign policy or to a certain extent development policy. I don't think the civilian community invest anywhere near as much time in understanding how the military works and how to use them as effectively as they might do. And this has played out countless lesson after lesson of conflict after conflict, is the real need of the civil service in the UK sense bureaucracy to invest time in that, and it very rarely does. And I think one of the key things moving forward, and I think the current experience in Sierra Leone has also made this quite a live issue, is to try and make sure that actually, as a key condition for people to work in very high-octane, crisis-ridden, fragile and conflict-affected states, a knowledge of how the military works, how to work with it and how to influence it is a key skill, I think, that needs to move forward. Just very conscious of time, so just in terms of the peace building and peace actors work and the question, it's an extension almost of one of the things I said at the start, I think, in that you're absolutely right, it's the first question. It's, I think, both curious to certain people and frustrating that each bit of the, for want of a better term, the international bureaucracy has its own mechanism, structures, funding, and certainly I know from colleagues of mine who work very regularly in Somalia, one of the things that communities have fed back they find hugely frustrating is the same district community meets on one day to discuss a peace building mechanism, the next day it's discussing the provision of water and sanitation, the next day it's discussing healthcare or whatever it might be. It's the same people, and we, I think, as the international community, are taking up huge amounts of people's time in resource constrained environments to deal with each of these issues separately. However, and you'll know better than me, attempts that have been made at the policy agenda to try and group a range of different issues have always fallen foul by some of those bureaucratic challenges that Oliver announced. And I think trying perhaps to ensure that from a demand-driven perspective, beneficiaries feed this information up more regularly than sometimes they feel empowered to do is important, because it's not the status quo isn't helpful. And now on Sheila's question, I mean, I think I defer to echo it. I mean, basically you're absolutely right. I think it is a key research gap. I think the real challenge is going to be trying to make sure that if such a piece of work was commissioned, it was done in such a way that survived the myriad of different contexts in which the answer would be different. But I think probably the first step is trying to, and this is what I was going to say a little bit when we get to this, is as a first order is trying to make sure as a condition before people get heavily engaged in activity that they really understand the political context, the social contract, the political settlement, call it what you will, in which they work, which, as you well know, very, very rarely happens before the tyranny of the now kicks in and people need to engage. So it's really key.
Thank you, and Oliver.
Yes, very briefly, given that we're running out of time, just also echoing what's been said and maybe starting in that direction as well. Yes, the social contract, I think definitely we should think about this some more. And I was just now listening to you also thinking of James Ferguson's Anti-Politics Machine, one of my all-time favorite reads, right? We do a lot of the work in these countries perhaps with a bunch of state bureaucrats and not necessarily with the politicians. I just thought of thinking of Madagascar here, where we wrote the Peace and Conflict Impact Assessment for the UN after the fall of the coup d'etat and after the fall of Marc Ravalomanana in late 2009. And what was striking there was you have 170-ish odd political parties, right? I want to go into politics, I create my own party. Right? There is actually no constituency necessarily. And what was strange, though, was, as you were saying, there are lots of donor engagement all the time and this, that, the other, doing their technocratic kind of silo, health and education and this, that, the other. The only donor over the last decade who had ever put any money into the Parliament of Madagascar was the European Commission. It was 300,000 euros. Right? Nobody else. There's a shabby building. Nobody ever thinks about parliamentary system as maybe being the right. There is this knee-jerk reaction, I think, in post-conflict settings, and Tim Sisk and others have written a lot about this. We need to get to elections really quickly. And then we see that a lot of time that goes pear-shaped because maybe society isn't ready for those elections yet. But again, elections means a functioning party political system in some sense. And that often we might be losing because we are so focused on development. And that, I think, gets me to your question as well, development and peace-building actors. In Madagascar, our analysis was a little bit, folks, the fact that you have a coup d'etat every couple of years is because it's taken as a problem of development. Madagascar, thankfully, never became Côte d'Ivoire. They were on the brink of a civil war a couple of times, but it never happened. And hence, nobody puts on a post-conflict or peace-building or any lens. Madagascar is a development problem, right? And thus, it doesn't come with those kind of tools necessarily. Hence, again, that disconnect. And I think mass media are very important in this. Again, I can't really answer your question because I don't have the evidence in terms of which kind of post-conflict setting. But again, what we did in Madagascar was say we need to do a media analysis. Because if you want to have all these parties and if you want to have that kind of representative system, what's the deal with the media? So I definitely think it's something that should be part of our notions of that social contract and how we make a parliamentary system the legitimate representative system of society. Maybe just a very, very last word on the military actors. I liked your question. It got me thinking of counterinsurgency, so-called COIN strategies, right? That certain, even American military strategists are very happy to see being implemented in Rio's favelas all of a sudden, right? Let's invade the favela in time for the Olympics with armored personnel carriers, right? And this idea that it's about counterinsurgency tactics, i.e. winning the hearts and minds of populations, which is after all also what we do with development work, right? Working with the local community is one, as Mark knows very well, is one I think that we'll have to discuss more in the years ahead. But I think it's interesting to see how after the Cold War, when none of that was happening, Swiss Agency for Development Cooperation was doing something in the country, and foreign and maybe a bit of defense was doing something as well. They weren't necessarily talking to each other, neither at headquarters or at or not in the field, and that's not a critique of the Swiss, it's the same for the Norwegians or anybody else. You had development folks doing development work, and you had other folks doing something else peace-related. And that somehow is still the case, but then again isn't. And I think that's just made it for very interesting times, perhaps.
Well, I think I have to say thank you very much to our panelists, because we have run out of time, and also thank you to Lisa, who I suspect has gone to sleep. I would have if I were her in her timeline. But just to briefly do a very quick plug for something that may help address Shilag's question, which is that there's going to be coming a development progress study on multidimensional dimensions of multi-dimensional progress in Ghana, talking about voice, health, and education. And I think one of the key lessons that emerges in the Ghanaian experience is that there has, for whatever reason, which we seek to explain in the report, been an understanding among elites from very early on, post-independence, about the need to develop some kind of a social contract with their citizens to provide peace and stability and hopefully progress. So watch that space. Thank you.